B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Wednesday, September 18th, 2019. It's a little too early to call the Israeli election definitively. But the early returns in this do-over election show that Benjamin Netanyahu is in deeper trouble than he was before. Now, again, we're working off preliminary count and exit polls, but what it showed is that Netanyahu's Likud party picked up 31 seats in the Knesset. You need 61 for a majority. The Blue and White Party, led by Benny Gantz, the former military leader, according to The Guardian, based in Britain, garnered 32 seats. Now, according to the Washington Post, it is 31 each. So that would make it a dead heat or a tie. So the deal breakers include Avigdor Lieberman, who has rebranded himself as some sort of a unifying figure and a would-be moderate in the current scene in Israel. And his party garnered 9 seats in the future Knesset. The big surprise was the Arab Israelis, who were holding, I think, 6 seats in the last Knesset, and this time they earned 12. So 12 and 9 is only an additional 21. And you add that to the 31 seats of the other parties, and you still don't get to 61. What this means is that we're going to have a lot of jockeying and wheeling and dealing. And we have to be prepared that Bibi Netanyahu, who is determined to hang on, if only to prevent prosecution for various crimes of graft and corruption. And that's what led to his desperate effort over the past few weeks to hold on by any means necessary. Now, the election turnout was nearly 70%, and I think that is an impressive number. But we need to understand that Israel is not a direct democracy. You vote for parties, parties select people to join the Knesset, and it is the majority, the 61 count, that essentially helps determine who the prime minister will be and what party he comes from. Now, I always look to Haaretz, the liberal, so it goes, outlet there in Israel. And I wasn't disappointed today. I've linked to a column by Yossi Verter, and he excoriates Netanyahu. This is the opening paragraph. After a crude and thuggish campaign in which he trampled the election laws alongside his son, who attacked every government institution, it looks as though Prime Minister Netanyahu is closer than ever to losing power. Avigdor Lieberman, on the other hand, who repeated his pre-election promises, will probably be the key person in the next Knesset. The term kingmaker is liberally applied to the illiberal Avigdor Lieberman. And after midnight last night, he said, Lieberman, everything I promised before the election I will fulfill. In other words, only a liberal national unity government with him, Likud, and one of the conservative parties, Kahol Lavan. But our Haaretz writer, Mr. Verter, continues, in such a situation, immunity from prosecution is off the agenda. That would be a case where Netanyahu gets pushed aside in one manner or another. Netanyahu's hearing is only 2 weeks away. He'll arrive weak and vulnerable. We shouldn't be surprised if we wake up one day to a plea bargain. Netanyahu has never been as close to losing power. Continuing to quote here, it's very hard to see how he can form the next government, whether a narrow government of 61 members, which he doesn't have, or a national unity government, which he doesn't have either. In light of the results, Benny Gantz and his colleagues in the leadership of Kahol Lavan, I think that's blue and white, will not agree to accept rotation in 2 years from now. So this puts the generally, symbolic president of Israel in the hot seat. Reuven Rivlin has the discretion to choose who has the best chance of assembling a majority coalition within 28 days. And since he tilted to Netanyahu after the spring election, there is some speculation that he'll give Benny Gantz a chance to form a government this time. And columnist Werder suggests that Netanyahu has done deep damage to the Likud party. He said the campaign he waged led tens of thousands of sane moderate voters to flee Likud, people who are mainstream in their worldview, who couldn't tolerate the attacks by him and his son against every government institution. Quote, "I will never vote for that family," a veteran Likudnik told me this week. And he continues, "There's never been such a violent, false, racist, inciting, and base election campaign as that conducted by Netanyahu personally. In recent days, the man who will be 70 in October embarked on an insane, almost psychotic blitz of running around and telling lies in every possible space. And he even broke the rules by appearing on radio stations in Israel on Election Day, which I believe violates their rules." So the Arab Israelis, who make up about 20% of the voting population, showed up in a larger number than expected. The turnout for the Israeli Arabs was only 50% in April, but we don't have an estimate of what their actual turnout was yesterday. Meanwhile, the region is still roiled by last Saturday's attack on Saudi oil facilities and the U.S. reaction, which is to just firmly blame Iran for it, despite the continuing lack of evidence. So Mike Pompeo, who plays Secretary of State on this reality show, decried those attacks and called them an act of war, as Trump has ordered a substantial increase in sanctions against Iran. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia trotted out debris from what it said were Iranian-made weapons used in the attacks on their two key oil facilities, and Iran warned the United States it would broadly retaliate against any attacks on it. So it's not clear to me how much further we can sanction Iran. It's clear to me we should not give the president sole authority to issue sanctions and tariffs, for that matter. So Pompeo is in Saudi Arabia, where he'll meet and hold hands with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and he better wash those hands to get the blood off them. Iran sent this warning via the Swiss embassy in Tehran. Iran's response will be prompt and strong, and it may include broader areas than the source of attacks. They also criticized the United States for failing to issue visas for the advance team for President Rouhani to attend the UN General Assembly next week in New York. So the threats continue to be exchanged. Pompeo maintains that our intelligence community has high confidence that the weapons systems used in the attacks were not in the Houthis' arsenal. This was an Iranian attack. It didn't come from the Houthis, he flatly states, without evidence. And if you haven't heard it yet, I recommend my in-depth interview with Pepe Escobar, Part 1, released yesterday, Part 2 coming up today. And in Part 1, he said his sources in Iran indicate that they are not directly involved with the Houthi military operation, and that the cruise missiles and the drones, we're told 7 cruise missiles and 18 drones, were used as part of this coordinated attack. And Pepe says that those are part of the arsenal that's been developed by the Houthis. In fact, there was a news conference that wasn't covered in the United States, probably because Trump tweeted some bullshit. But just a couple of months ago, the Houthis did a show and tell and displayed some of their cruise missiles. So let's turn to one of the leading access journalists in the United States. And when I say access, these are people who trade favors with intelligence community sources so that they will get the next leaks. And in exchange, they go easy on the intelligence community. So David Sanger is the bureau chief for the Times in Washington, and his comments here about Trump are legit. He says, for a president with a loose relationship with the facts, poisonous relationships with allies, the attack on the Saudi oil fields poses a challenge. How to prove the administration's case that Iran was behind the strike and rally the world to respond. So David Sanger doesn't offer any personal inference here that he doesn't believe the claims. But he says that Trump's credibility is the issue. Over the next few days or weeks, Trump will almost certainly face the reality that much of the world, angry at his tweets, tirades, untruths, and accusations, could be disinclined to believe the arguments advanced by Pompeo and others that Iran bears responsibility for the attack. If Trump tries to gather a coalition to impose diplomatic penalties, tighten sanctions, or retaliate with a military or cyber strike, he may discover that, like Bush, George W. Bush, heading into Iraq, he is largely alone. What about the coalition of the billing there? Sanger, you're rewriting history? Let's continue. Intelligence officials are hinting that the evidence implicating Iran is just too delicate to make public. See, access journalism. He doesn't name those intelligence officials, but he believes them. One theory gaining support among American officials is that the cruise missile and drone attack was launched from southwest Iran or in the waters nearby. But the evidence gathered so far isn't a slam dunk, says another unnamed official. Access journalism. Then we have the first named source in the article, Obama's negotiator on the Iran deal, Wendy Sherman, who's a pretty hawkish militarist, and she would have been a top official in the Hillary Clinton administration. Anyway, she obliges here. Painfully, the word of the president will be suspect. Now, all of this is true. Trump lies and bullshits and dissembles to the point where, and he shifts his position, he contradicts himself, he, rejects video clips of himself and calls them fake news. Yes, he has zero credibility, but so does the American intelligence community. And David Sanger will hint that the evidence is a little weak, it's a little sketchy. But he will not bite the sources that keep him one of America's top access journalists. You can count on that. So the Saudis held a news conference, and they show pictures. They bring out some of the debris, and they present Colonel Turki al-Maliki. This attack was launched from the north and was unquestionably sponsored by Iran. What the hell does sponsored mean? I mean, Raytheon sponsors a whole lot of stuff in the American media, and they also profit greatly when we launch their cruise missiles and Patriot missiles, etc. So, what is really interesting, the New York Times, in about paragraph 12 of this story, says it was not clear how the evidence shown by the Saudis indicated that the attack came from the north or did not come from Yemen. Duh. And as the finger-pointing amid all this confusion continues, the Saudis, while they claim that Iran sponsored this, have enough doubt that they're asking for an international investigation. Now, this is very rare. The Saudis don't trust the UN. They don't want to submit to any scrutiny by an outside group. Consider the Khashoggi investigation, right? But they're now saying that they would like the United Nations to investigate this. And so we'll see if this fizzles. We'll see if there are some stand-up intelligence agencies who might contradict the United... Oh, no, there's nothing like that in the world today. Daydreaming again, my apologies. Also, I want to note that The Guardian does affirm what Pepe Escobar reported yesterday, that the versions of the weapons that were used in the attack last weekend were displayed by the Houthis at a small arms exhibition on July 7th. So, at least that is evidence that they have them. Did they use them? They say yes. But that's inconvenient for the United States. Trump doesn't want to pummel the Houthis in Yemen. He has relegated that to the Saudis. At any rate, Pepe Escobar, once again, is a tremendous international observer. I highly respect his reporting, the sources that he has all around the world, and he's not tainted by being an American or being linked to the U.S. media. And so I am issuing part 2 of my conversation with journalist Pepe Escobar today. And in it, we talk about Hong Kong. And I'm going to include part of my question in this clip where you'll hear Pepe's answer, that in the full interview goes into more detail about who's in charge in Hong Kong and what's going down there. Tell me what you see going on and respond to the claims from some journalists in America that the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, is investing heavily in the protests in Hong Kong. Is that visible? Is that apparent in any way? Or do you view this as purely organic?
No. It's a mix of both. The protests against the local government, they absolutely proceed because the local government in Hong Kong, which is basically picked by 1,200 unelected people, and obviously the approval from Beijing is absolutely essential. It's basically a government of oligarchs, to the benefit of oligarchs. And Beijing had an understanding with these oligarchs. Okay, you take care of Hong Kong for us. Okay, don't screw up. The problem is they did screw up. And Carrie Lam, now the current CEO, she could not manage a high school. Can you imagine a society as complex as Hong Kong? She fucked up big time. So everything that people complain about the government being completely divorced from the needs of the population is true.
That's Pepe Escobar. You can hear the full interview released to subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher. And as always, Pepe is informative and quite entertaining as he covers world news. This podcast and the Pepe interview all made possible by the support of listeners like you who subscribe, including Brian Massey, Billy Cook in Eureka, Brian Carey, and Ian Berman. They all chip in $5, $10 a month, and I ask you to do it too. That's how we keep the lights on and keep dog treats for Chloe here. So come on over to peterbcollins.com. Find the menu tab, click on it, then jump to become a subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and in seconds you can choose a PayPal subscription level that's comfortable for you and your budget. And if you don't like PayPal, it's okay. You can communicate with me in the U.S. Mail, Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Speaking of Hong Kong, I was curious. Yesterday, I opened my San Francisco Chronicle. The front news section on page A3 is a paid advertisement from the government of Hong Kong. HK building bridges across the Pacific. Now, the bridge in question here is the one to Macau, not any bridges to peace in Hong Kong. And it's just this propaganda about great things going in Hong Kong, and that there is an exhibition up until September 21st at the Chandran Gallery in San Francisco. Just an effort to keep the business community connected to Hong Kong. Carol Rosenberg has done some of the best reporting on Guantanamo Bay. Really, the only other reporter who's been as dedicated is Andy Worthington, the British volunteer reporter. And Rosenberg now writes for the New York Times in some sort of a partnership with the Pulitzer Center. I don't know why they always refer to that. Anyway, she's breaking the story that at Guantanamo, they have been secretly taping conversations between prisoners. And they set up Amr al-Baluchi, who is one of the 5 defendants in the 9/11 charges. And he is accused of essentially being the paymaster. And in one case, they parked al-Baluchi in a cell next to somebody else and recorded their conversations. And the somebody else was helping him rehearse a confession. Now, what is unknown is if the confession, let's put that in air quotes, was simply a prisoner desperate to find some way out, serving up the so-called evidence that his interrogators had been asking him about for years. And by admitting some guilt or full guilt, maybe they hope to someday be sentenced and released from Guantanamo. But number one, this is a sneaky tactic that shows that the U.S. is not committed to justice. They simply want to win these trials at all costs. And secondly, al-Baluchi may actually have been involved, but all of the information shows that he didn't know the details of the 9/11 plot. It was compartmentalized. And he, in one of these so-called confessions, he says that the bulk of the money that went to the alleged hijackers came from him. Well, we'll have to see how it plays out if there is ever a trial. Now, speaking of 9/11, we know that on September 11th of this year, Trump showed a picture of his back and Melania's back early in the day, honoring the victims of 9/11, and then he spent the rest of the day hate tweeting. Well, yesterday he retweeted a clip of a video of one of the members of the squad, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, dancing. Now, the clip clearly shows that this dangerous dance took place on September 13th. It was part of a Congressional Black Caucus event, and then they did some dancing. But Trump mischaracterized this brazenly by saying that she was dancing in celebration on 9/11. She was partying on 9/11. That's the phrase he used. And I tried to print them out, but the tweets didn't print. What was really ugly is that all of the people who piled on, adding to Trump's tweet, saying send her home and all that kind of stuff, it's just amazing. And this is why when the Democrats operate in such a cautious manner, they're afraid of impeachment. They're afraid to take a clear stand. And this is why Democrats are vulnerable, because if Trump does these kind of tweets for 3 weeks before the November elections next year, will Democrats be able to hold the House? That is a known unknown, as Dr. Rumsfeld might have said. Also, speaking of the squad, there's an interesting interview in today's New York Times. I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is quoted as saying that she is learning how to play by Washington's rules. After 9 months, with her eyes now wide open to the downsides of her revolutionary reputation and social media fame, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez has tempered her brash institution-be-damned style with something different, a careful political calculus that adheres more closely to the unwritten rules of Washington she once disdained. So the Times is saying, hey, maybe she's going to be okay. Maybe she's going to play the game. Maybe she can be bought and manipulated. Well, she has come out endorsing a primary challenger to a Democratic colleague, ultra-conservative Dan Lipinski of Illinois. Now, she's not the first to do that, but because of who she is, well, that puts her under a very hot spotlight. Quote from AOC, it's not just about being an activist, it forces you to grow. So it doesn't mean you don't endorse activists, but it also requires an assessment for a capacity of growth and how you navigate a space like this. She says, in many ways, I feel like I walk around, she's talking about the halls of the Capitol, with a scarlet letter, because many members who just have any primary, whether I know about it or not, tend to project that onto me. In many ways, I feel like I walk through that body as a symbol of someone who should not be there and a threat to the way power is organized. She said she's gone through a loss of innocence and naivete, realizing that it was impossible to separate the legislative work of serving in the Congress with the politics of re-election campaigns. They are frankly much closer in that dynamic and much closer in overlapping than a lot of people tend to realize. I don't have any problem with AOC growing in the job, learning the ways of Washington. But the New York Times makes it seem like her fangs have been removed. Now, I criticize AOC because she has not explicitly separated herself from mainstream Democrats on policy toward regime change in Venezuela. But on most other issues, I think she's pretty good, including the Green New Deal, which now has competition from corporate Democrats led by a slimy guy from San Diego named Tom Peters. I called him Tom. Scott Peters, pardon me. He is vice chair of the New Democrats, and he hates the Green New Deal. So he's proposing, I don't know what you would call it, something very light, saying that, gosh, we got to get going on this climate change stuff, but nothing extreme, okay? And that doesn't make any sense. In The Guardian today, Bill McKibben, the putative leader of America's climate change movement, is asking you to go on strike this Friday, September 20th. And he has a litany of one-sentence statements. I'll just pick 4. Strike because the people who did the least to cause this crisis suffer first and worst. Strike because we've already lost half the animals on the planet since 1970. Strike because our governments move with such painful slowness, treating climate change as, at worst, one problem on a long list. Also at The Guardian, and by the way, there is a coordinated media effort to draw attention to climate change issues timed to the conference at the UN next week. So, don't get all conspiratorial. But The Guardian also profiles, without naming them, 6 whistleblowers and former government scientists who've been muzzled under the Trump administration. One was an engineer at the EPA who was shocked when his work was turned into an 8-year freeze on greenhouse gas standards. It broke my heart, he said. I was 62 years old. I felt I could do more on the outside, educating the public on what's going on, and so I left. Here's another person who worked at the National Park Service. I was studying how climate change will affect 118 coastal parks. I started work on this in 2013. It was my baby. And then her report got stalled, the release was. Then she went on maternity leave, and when she came back, it still hadn't been released. Then goons from Washington came out, and it became incredibly hostile, she said. I was told not to attribute changes in public lands to human actions. And we were told the president is the boss. We're going to put our heads down and put out the line of the administration. Then they cut her pay to $25,000. She then offered to work for free, but nevertheless, they forced her to leave her job at the Park Service. And the Secretary General of the UN, in advance of the climate summit, says we need to have the whole society putting pressure on governments to understand they need to run faster because we are losing the race. And a little bright spot in the climate news in Jamaica. A good feature story from the Associated Press today. A man named Everton Simpson is one of many coral gardeners. And they go underwater and they nurse coral into healthy sprouts. And then they transplant the coral onto reefs that have bleached and are largely dead. I'm glad to see that. Corey Lewandowski went to Capitol Hill yesterday to stonewall his way into a U.S. Senate race. He's planning to run in New Hampshire, we are told. And he just flatly hammered the Democrats who tried to question him about Trump's orders for him to tell Jeff Sessions to get Bob Mueller to back off. And Lewandowski, ever the Trump loyalist, was very effective in obstructing the efforts of the Democrats to get him on the record. And it was a real stunning and disgraceful episode that will likely be repeated as the Democrats pursue this misguided effort at impeachment, as David Swanson told us last week, based on Russiagate. The Intercept today, under the byline of David Stein, has another truth-telling story about Joe Biden as he tries to rewrite his record on crime and race. And I encourage you to read it. He takes you back to the Reagan era, when Joe Biden was a senator, trying to stake out his position as a Democrat who was super tough on crime. It led him to criticize the Reagan administration for not appointing a drug czar as he had proposed. And it was Joe Biden in the Democratic caucus saying, "Give me the crime issue, you'll never have trouble with it in an election." And so he now tries to paint himself as a kinder, gentler kind of fellow, and I, for one, am not buying it. I've also linked to a piece published in the Washington Post today by Kathleen Parker, and it's pretty deadly. Now, her invective here is informed by what appears to be support for Trump and a denial of any of the allegations against Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh. But her skewering of the New York Times for the way it omitted key facts when it published the book excerpt last weekend that brought renewed interest in Kavanaugh and his accusers. Well, this is a devastating indictment of yellow journalism by the New York Times, and it undermines legitimate efforts to draw attention to Kavanaugh's deficits, and it undermines any effort to launch true impeachment either now or in the future. Very sad. Finally today, I want to thank a listener who linked me up to an article at Vice Motherboard, which details how the repo men and women across the country have taken on an ambitious effort, and they have collected a database of 9 billion license plate scans. Now, some of those are the same car more than once. You get that, right? But when they scan the license plate, they also collect its GPS location. And that database is an invasion of your privacy because you're not guilty of anything. You don't have a car they're trying to repossess. They have no basis to collect data on you, but they have. It's called the Digital Recognition Network. And I'll explain why this caught my attention. I had an episode where the repo men came for me. And there were women on the team, too. And they were low-life. I can't actually describe just how disgusting these people were. Now, I had bought a used car from a woman who did not pay off her auto loan as she had promised. And before I could straighten that out with her, the repo team was knocking on my door at 8 o'clock in the morning. Now, I had secured the car at a location they couldn't find. But they made repeated efforts. They broke the law, coming on my property and knocking on my door, harassing me and my family. And so I have no sympathy for repo people. And the fact that they're collecting data on all of us, our cars and our locations, just another chip away at our Bill of Rights under the U.S. Constitution. Thanks for listening to my ranting and raving, my daily news and comment podcast. Please share it everywhere. Find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.